Hello, welcome everyone to the MassTLC Talent community meeting today, discussing a very, very important topic, which is bias awareness to action. I was just telling the panelists that it's taken MassTLC time to find the right group of panelists to address this topic, and I think we found them, and it will definitely be to everyone's benefit today. A short bit about MassTLC. We are the largest, most powerful tech organization council in New England. And our purpose is to accelerate growth, innovation, and the development of an inclusive tech ecosystem. Thank you to our community sponsor, Cangrade, and of course to our global sponsors. Without them, we couldn't do all that we do with our community development. In today's discussion, the biggest topic we'll be tackling is understanding mitigation and intentionality. I'd like to introduce Deb Becker, who helped pull this topic together. She is executive and leadership coach at Becker Leadership Impact. Also, Kameelah Benjamin-Fuller, chief diversity officer and CSR leader at PTC, and Liana Epstien, chief analytics officer at Cangrade. Deb, would you like me to switch over to your slides?
No, not yet. If we can just, we'll go slide free for a couple minutes here. So thanks so much. And again, welcome everybody. So we're going to do some introductions first, and then I've just got a couple of quick slides that I'll share, and then we'll jump into the discussion. I just did also want to let folks know I did put a question into the chat. So feel free to, ponder the question and put your responses into the chat. That'll actually help myself as well as the other panelists get a good sense of where you are and what you're thinking about for today's panel. So of course, I do have some questions already prepared for our panelists, but we will be coming to you all in the chat in terms of some questions that you'd like to hear the panelists respond to as well. So to get us started, I'd love to welcome Kameelah Benjamin-Fuller into the panel today. As Nayla said, Kameelah is the Chief Diversity Officer and Corporate Social Responsibility Leader for PTC. And so Kameelah, I'd love if you could share a little bit more about PTC, a little bit more about yourself and your role, and what is so important to you about the topic today.
Hello, everyone. Great to be here with you. And I am addicted to this work. I can't get enough. And what a challenging, interesting, and dynamic time it is to have conversations like this. So I'm very much looking forward to engaging in dialogue with all of you. I'm almost to the day, a year into my role at PTC. Prior to PTC, I was at TripAdvisor, also brought in to help build their diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And then I spent about a decade at Korn Ferry doing work in leadership development, DE&I. And then prior to that, I was at Procter & Gamble, Gillette, also in the same space. So this has been like a lifelong habit for me. PTC is an incredibly dynamic organization. We're based in the Boston area. We have employees globally, customers and partners globally, and we're focused on CAD, PLM, SaaS, Internet of Things. If you think about, particularly in industrial engineering and manufacturing, we are in there creating software and opportunities for people to work across distance, to use our software to service equipment in ways that are just completely innovative, and to design and collaborate remotely. So if you have any interest in sort of digging into our technology, it's particularly during the past year when we've talked more about remote work, hybrid work, working across distance, collaboration tools. There's some pretty dynamic things there that might be of interest to you. I'm also a mom, and at any point, my 12-year-old might get up. She's remote schooling today, so I might have to like pop in and just remind her to get up. But and I'm a caretaker of my mom who has dementia, so I have a very dynamic world that I'm in. But we'll talk more about sort of my experiences as we go through the morning. And thank you for having me.
Kameelah, thank you so much. And really excited to hear so many of your thoughts and your perspectives. And again, you've worked across so many different companies and industries as well. And so really being able to bring that into the conversation will be really interesting. So we'll shift gears slightly here to Liana Epstien, and who is the Chief Analytics Officer at Cangrade. And so just wanted to welcome Liana in, and also Liana, if you too can share your background a little bit about Cangrade, your role, and again for you too, what brings you to the panel today and passion around this work.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Deb. I'm really excited to be here with Kameelah and Deb today to get to talk through this just critical issue with all of you. To echo Kameelah's sentiment, this is work that I am addicted to as well. I originated in this work with more of an academic bent. My doctorate's in social psychology, and my research focused around issues of diversity and equity and inclusion. I actually started out working with police departments many years ago. And so I spent a lot of time in the public sector trying to use social psychology and research methodology to really champion these ideas of diversity, equity, and inclusion as not an afterthought or a nice to have, but as something that fundamentally keeps us safer and makes our society better. About 7 years ago, I had the pleasure and the privilege to co-found Cangrade along with my CEO. And we really set out to bring this passion for diversity, equity, and inclusion to the private sector. Cangrade's goal as a company is to help organizations hire smarter by focusing on soft skills that really level the playing field in a critical way. And we'll talk about that a lot more in detail today, but that's our core passion and mission as a company. It's something that's incredibly personal to me. And certainly my experience in the workforce has shaped and informed a lot of what I tried to bring as a scientist when we were developing this solution. So I'm really just so excited to see the amount of interest in the private sector for DE&I these days. It's fantastic that this is a core value that so many of you care about as well, and that you are willing to log on at 8:30 in the morning to talk about it. So I'm thrilled to get the chance to have a discussion with Kameelah and Deb today about it, and really looking forward to all of your questions.
Thank you so much, Liana. And we're starting to see some questions coming into the chat, which is great. And so again, as questions pop up for you, please put them into the chat as well. And so just a quick little bit about me. As Nayla said before, I'm Deb Becker with Becker Leadership Impact. And my background is that I come out of the aerospace and defense industry. Though if everyone can go on mute, that would be great. That would
be somewhere.
All right.
Figure it out.
Kristen Keen, if you can put yourself on mute, that would be great. Thank you. So as I said, my name is Deb Becker. I come out of the aerospace and defense industry. I also do a lot of work with pharma and biotech, construction, financial services. So I really run the gamut in terms of leaders who I work with and types of organizations and sizes of organizations as well. And my whole goal is to really help develop leaders for incredible impact. And so it's doing that, especially within the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, also helping upskill managers with their own coaching skills, as well as a number of other leadership areas as well. So I am going to be a broken record, just like Liana and Kameelah here. I too love this work and think that there is so much power and opportunity that if we really are able to not only understand what bias is and our own biases, but the bigger piece is what are the effects on other people, systems within organizations, and what are the actions that we can take individually as a team and as an organization to mitigate bias, to ensure that we've got environments where everybody can not only bring their whole selves to work, but where everyone can grow and thrive in their career growth and development. So that's a little bit about me, and we had a great prep conversation, so I'm excited to dive in. So Nayla, if we could just bring up the first slide, I'm just going to do some quick level setting here, and then we'll jump right into the questions. Super. So thanks so much. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page here, you can see here, this is a definition of unconscious bias from Dr. Renee Navarro. And what I really loved about it is you can almost break it down into kind of three sections of what she says, that when we look at bias, there are attitudes or stereotypes that we may have. And we all have bias. I will start off by saying that. Some of our attitudes or stereotypes may be similar to each other, and there might be some that each of us have based on our own upbringing and the kind of the immediate worlds that we live within. But these attitudes or stereotypes affect our understanding, our actions and decisions. So really interesting that some of the thoughts that we have, some whether unconscious or conscious, have impacts that maybe we intend or sometimes are unintended. And again, because we're focused on unconscious bias, that they're affecting actions, decisions, and understanding in an unconscious manner. So again, our actions or decisions may be having an unintended impact or consequence. And sometimes when we recognize what's actually happening or how we're being received, that can be really jarring because that's not our intent. So the other thing I just wanted to mention here is to be biased or to have bias is to be human. The way humans are constructed, the way our brains are constructed, our brains love shortcuts. We are taking in millions of data points every single second, and our brains need shortcuts to be able to operate because we can only consciously focus on about 30 or 40 data endpoints at a time. So there's kind of a biologic reason for some shortcuts that our brain takes, but this is where, being humans, we have the capability to think. And so now we need to kind of do that double check to say, is our brain doing the right thing or the best thing? So just a very quick analogy, if you think about an operating system on your phone or on your computer, it usually comes fully installed and you just say, yep, check, install everything the way it's supposed to be. What are the factory settings? This is where, sometimes it's like, oh, I wish I could change this about my phone, or I could change that about my computer. And this is where you actually do have the admin rights. You have the admin password to change your internal operating system. So how your brain has been thinking, what that mapping has been. And you can start to say, wait a minute, time out. Is this thinking really leading me to have the impact that I really want? And that's where the power comes in. And so I know I saw the question in the chat already. How do you start to mitigate? How do you start to change? And it's when you recognize the biased thinking and what you want to do about that. So just kind of let that, you can mull that over a little bit or just let it marinate. That's the word I was going for. So if we go to the next slide, Nayla, and just so everyone knows, this is the I only have 2 slides here. I just, again, wanted to anchor folks in just a couple of common workplace biases, and then we'll jump into the questions. So one bias is the similarity affinity bias. So this is, as you can see, the tendency to be attracted to people who look like us or think like us. So it's oftentimes if somebody went to your same school or grew up in the same area as you, you automatically start to feel an affinity towards them. Not necessarily a bad thing unless you're using it to base decisions on. So again, think about how that comes into play. Oftentimes we see this in hiring, promotion decisions, things like that. Neil, if you can click forward, that would be great. We'll bring up the next bias here. And click forward once more.
Sorry, Deb, I only have 2 slides.
I know, but there should be another bias. There we go. Thanks.
Oh, sorry.
Just disappeared again.
Get it?
So the halo and horns effect. So what this really is identifying, and hopefully it'll appear on screen. If not, no worries. Is that the halo effect is that if you know something good about somebody, then that just kind of colors your whole perception of them. And so you just think everything they do is really good. And conversely, the horns effect is if you've had a negative experience with somebody or you know something that you consider to be negative about them, then they're always painted in a negative light for you. And then the third bias that I wanted to share today was the name bias. And so this is where when you see a name on a resume or you hear somebody's name, all of a sudden you have you perceive something about their background. And sometimes it can, elevate them, and sometimes it could, lower them in your own esteem. So just recognizing that biases can have a building up effect, and they can also have a depressing effect, depending on how you're, depending on what they are. So with that, I just had wanted to do a little bit of that level setting so we all were on the same playing field. So we can pull the slides down now. Thank you so much. Those were just a few biases. There are, 100 biases that we could look at, but again, just wanted to get us started there. So with that, we will now jump right in. And again, please just, if you have any questions or reactions or insights to anything that I'm sharing or any of the panelists share, please do pop those into the chat. So with that, I'm going to just start us off here. And I'm going to come to Liana first here. And when you think about if we look at bias and looking at ourselves to begin with, how do you see leaders increasing their acumen in this space to then be able to move to action? So not just staying in that awareness space, but moving to action.
Yeah, I think that highlighting that straight off the bat is just critical to understanding how to actually move the needle on this issue. And I'm sure Kameelah can speak more to what that's like in practice. But I know that certainly in our work with different organizations, what I've seen is that it's about recognizing that the change needs to come from inside, that locus of control is inside. So even in some cases where you're hiring a consultant and that's someone sort of coming from the outside and telling you about a shift that you could or couldn't make, it really takes a reckoning at the executive level, at the leadership level, to be able to internalize that, hey, we need to really take a hard look at our values and then shift them to make sure that it's in alignment with this idea of diversity, equity, inclusion. We're not just making superficial changes. We're not just, establishing a group for Latino employees to get to know each other. We're really making sure that the way we're hiring people is not systematically excluding Latino employees from the core of the organization. So it's about not seeing it as a checkbox or a one-off quick fix or a Band-Aid, but actually about making a systemic commitment to turning your culture inside out and integrating it into the very core of who you are as a company.
Liana, thank you so much for that. And it's so fascinating when you think about, that it's really starting from that place of self, as you said, integrating it into the core of who you are, and then, almost emanating from there into that systemic level. So really just that one's going to stick with me for a little bit. So I appreciate that. So Kameelah, let me come to you with the same question. What have you seen, or what recommendations do you have for how leaders can really increase their own awareness to then be able to move to action?
The most powerful examples that I have seen of this is leaders who are able to move themselves from saying, I want to change and I don't know what to do, to I want to change and here are actions I'm thinking about taking. What feedback do you have for me? And the distinction there is that there is this helplessness that has set in with kind of the wave of information about the world, how the world works. There are many people who are surprised around what was happening last summer with George Floyd's murder, BLM. A lot of awakening was happening and folks felt like, oh my goodness, this is the way the world is. What do I do? I'm overwhelmed. And it's okay to be there for a moment. But then there are so many things that are available to individuals, to the individual to start to read and research and look for. And I can't tell you how many people in my life who I love and I still love dearly, but called me and asked me, you know, what do I do? How do I do this? What's going on? And it's like, and then I would get calls from people I hadn't heard from in 20 years. What do I do? How do I do this? Did I ever hurt you? Did I I'm like, who are you? Where are you coming from? Am I the only Black person that you know? So there's a level of self-leadership around the work that needs to be acknowledged, even if you don't have all the answers, that there's that first step can't always be leaning on the one person who you think might have the answers for you. There's plenty of content out there for folks to unpack. The other thing at the individual level, and I ask leaders to do this, and quite frankly, I ask people in my personal life to do this, is to assess your network. Do your network analysis, because the inputs that you are basing your thought processes over, the inputs that have created that hardwiring are from the folks that you've been surrounded with, the things that you watch, the representations that you've seen, the social media, the people that you follow on Instagram or LinkedIn. So what are your inputs? The people who you spend time with, the people who you get information from, the sources that you go to for understanding and processing things that are happening in the world. Is that diversified? And if it's not, that's a place to start, because no matter how many trainings you go through or how many chief diversity officers sit across from you and try to coach you through something, or you can do all of that work, but if you don't start to unpack the inputs that are crafting like the daily experiences that you have and are building that hardwiring, it's not going to shift.
Absolutely. Kameelah, I think that's a really interesting point you brought up about feedback and sort of this impulse for reaching out to the people in your network. I know I've been doing a lot of networking this year as a way to sort of build virtual community. And I had a networking call with a lovely internet stranger who he was working in an executive capacity in an organization. And one of the things that came up in our conversation is sort of apropos of nothing, I guess because we'd built enough rapport, he felt comfortable. He said, I'd mentioned that at some point, working in Silicon Valley, it wasn't the friendliest place to be a young looking female in the workplace. That was my personal experience. And he said something similar to what, folks coming out of the woodwork and calling you, which is, what can I do to be a better ally for women in the workplace? And I thought it was it's a nice gesture. It's a really great question. It's great that as, a white cis man, he's interested in learning, and that's fantastic. But it also bummed me out a little bit that I was the person that he sort of felt comfortable asking this question to, because there have to be other professional women in his life that he has more of a relationship with that maybe would be a better resource. And also, like you're saying, it's about taking that impulse and that impetus to really do the work on your own without leaning too much on the people that have some sort of marginalized identity in your network. And so I think that, again, that goes back to that shift that I was talking about on a macro level in an organization, on sort of a micro level with executives, is that you can't lean entirely on the people in your life with maybe more marginalized or underrepresented identities to do the work for you. And it's really about making sure that, again, that locus of control sits with you and that you are moving yourself and propelling yourself forward. And I think what you'll find is that people notice that, and they will spontaneously share their stories and their experiences with you around that without you having to sort of structured and ask for that feedback back from them. If you establish that sort of safe space, I think folks with underrepresented identities at work will be comfortable sharing those stories with you spontaneously. And again, Kameelah, like you're saying, that those sources of information will start to shift and change and grow, but that you really have to take that first push yourself.
Yeah, and just to add one thing to what you said was really important is, as I started, it's okay to start there, right? But you need to evolve. And then if you're doing that, be prepared to have different responses. So you could be the 5th person this week that's asked that question to someone, and they might be fatigued, or they might not have answers. Just because they are identified as being in a marginalized group or underrepresented doesn't mean that they've done the work to assess how to unpack the environment that they're in, right? We're not born with that skill set just because, or know how to translate that. So I think, one, as you were saying, right, that person asked that of you, okay, may not have been great. Fortunately, you're probably very gracious given the work that you do. But I think if you do take that vulnerable step and you do ask those questions, you also have to be prepared that you might not get the response that you're looking for, or it might strain the relationship.
And it also, just to build on what you're saying, it might be a different answer depending on who you talk to. I mean, not that I'm not emperor of all women, but women do think about things differently. I'm going to assume that Black and brown people have that same experience as well. So just also be prepared to get different answers, or like Kameelah said, different responses. It may be confusing at some point because you'll hear one thing from one person and one thing for another. And it's great that you're doing the work and asking the questions, and that's the important part.
I love this whole theme that both of you have brought up in terms of, the self-leadership piece of it. And, just moving from, and Kameelah, as you said, kind of the helplessness to intentionality and being proactive. Because when we think about how to mitigate bias, there is an intention there. You have to be very particular in what you're trying to do in terms of potentially changing, personal actions or actions that you're seeing within the organization. So just to kind of mirror some of the conversation that Liana and Kameelah were having, I did just start something in the chat for resources that people recommend. And this is really the request out to everybody. It's fantastic. We have over 40 people on this call. And so for those of you who have started doing some of this work, please pop into the chat 1 or 2 resources that you have found really helpful to help you grow in your awareness. Again, whether it's personally or as you apply it to the work setting. So I started things off with a couple of books that I have found really impactful, and I've seen a couple of other inputs from other people as well. So feel free, podcasts, social media influencers, who do you follow, books, articles, organizations. This is really where we can do a lot of best practice sharing with each other and really tap into the expertise that's on the call for all of the attendees. So, kind of sticking with this piece around the starting from self, and Kameelah, I'll come to you first with this question. As people start to become more aware of biases, and just even the fact that we all have biases, that is sometimes revolutionary for people just to start with. What recommendations do you have for people to kind of reconcile the feelings that start to come up of that it's all of a sudden we're in a very uncomfortable place, we're in a new place, that there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance, though we need to work through it. We don't want to run away from it. So how do you help people bridge from kind of ignorance is bliss to kind of that murky, muddy area?
Yeah, I think the first thing is in the question, it's acknowledging that it will potentially be uncomfortable, that the things that you have been taught your whole life, or the things that you have believed to be true, may be inaccurate, or may not be whole truths, right? And so being willing to have your foundation examined it's hard and it's personal. And that's when the work sort of, it can be easy to talk about it, but then when you really start to dig underneath and get to that stage of, questioning, it can be challenging. So I spent some time in graduate school in Miami. And I've also, my entire career, I've had a passion for music and theater and the arts, as well as the study of identity. And I wanted to bridge that work together. So I went and I studied Afro-Cuban folkloric dance and Afro-Latinx music in the Miami scene. And I was moving through that space as a dark-skinned Black woman. Most of the environments and clubs that I went in were patroned by light-skinned or white Cubans. Most of the performers and musicians were closer to my complexion. And it was this fascinating thing of sort of reconciling what was happening in the room. So I would start to ask people, why is this happening? And they would say, well, what do you mean? I said, well, do you not see that we don't have Black folks who are patronizing the place, dark-skinned Black folks? It's just like there's a difference between who's on stage and who's allowed to sort of take opportunity to be a patron. And it was like, no one wanted to be questioned about this challenge, right? Because their entire lives, they had felt like skin color, colorism is not a thing that's really impacting anyone. But then I talked to dark-skinned Cuban artists, and it absolutely was something that they had to navigate the whole time. So my thesis work was about unpacking that, right? That's a hard thing for people to do, because now you're talking about their family, like their friend circles, like all of that. So there's the first thing in order to sort of get through that is a willingness to understand that maybe the world is different than the way that you have perceived it. Or maybe there are other ways of interpreting the way that the world has been configured for you. And that maybe you've been sheltered around certain things. I know I'm still growing in learning about different dimensions of diversity that I have not had exposure to. And I have to realize that sometimes I might be wrong. I might get it wrong. My understanding might not be right. So it's not like a step-by-step, Deb, but it's a mindset. And I think the last thing I'll say here, which was hard for me to hear, but I was talking to, again, back in the Miami context, I was talking to some of the artists I was interviewing, and they said, here's the distinction for me. I will get hired anytime, because I'm a talented artist, to play in any club. But if I walk through the door and try to date or have a romantic relationship with these folks, it would never fly. It's like a different way that you're perceived as a human being. You can perform for me, but you can't be part of my family, right? And those are the moments where people have to take a step back and think about, okay, if this became about someone like being a part of my real inner circle, what's my level of comfort with that? What have I been taught about that?
Kameelah, I'm not usually at a loss for words. That last question that you just asked, and I'm not going to be able to get your words exactly right, but the notion of what does it mean that somebody can, happily exist in one part of my world, but I'm too uncomfortable for them to be in a different part of my world. And the awareness, and then how to work through that and reconcile that. There's a lot that's there, and it takes time. And it also, again, goes back to that self-leadership, that intentionality to really say, maybe this isn't a part of myself that I'm as proud of, or I really do need to learn more. And you really focused on that word mindset. And so it comes from that place of, being much more curious and open, and coming from a place of inquiry to see where it may take you, and kind of taking a step back from that judgment piece. Liana, please
Deb,
jump in.
if I could jump in also, Kameelah, I think what you said is really interesting. As someone, I've spent a lot of my adult life living in foreign countries, and living in countries in particular where I stand out quite a bit, where I'm not the norm, in Africa and in Asia. The last country that I lived in was Cambodia. And when I was sort of making the decision whether or not to re-up my contract after a couple of years, one of the things that kept going through my mind is, I really tried when I got there. I took language classes, I made an effort, I talked to my colleagues to really try to learn the culture and so on and so forth. And as I was thinking about whether or not I wanted to renew this contract, I just kept thinking, I can speak this language fluently, and I could even, marry a Cambodian and speak in their language and eat their food and move through space like they do, dress like they do. But I will never be Cambodian. I will always be the foreigner who is living in Cambodia. And I think experiences like that for me have really shaped the way I think about how people with very visible underrepresented identities move through space in the US, for example. That, just like you said, where you don't get to turn off your skin color when you perform or when you walk into someone's house for dinner. I think remembering this perspective of, I can, learn to speak your work language and, value the things I value and play golf with you on the weekends, but I'm always going to be visibly different, whatever way that is. And that's always going to make me feel some sort of other in a way that is simply different from how people who don't have those visible identities get to move through space and move through the world. I think for me, always the social psychology research that kind of hammers that home. There's this classic work on when you should ask people to identify their demographic categories when they're taking a standardized test. You think of something as simple as standardized testing. The whole goal of standardized testing is to be objective, right? The idea is that there's some sort of objective level of skill you have in math or in reading or whatever it is, and that is relatively unchanged if everybody takes the same multiple choice test. And what psychologists have found over and over again, no matter what you're testing with the standardized test, is moving people's performance around is simple enough as asking them to identify their ethnic and category and gender before taking the test. And that if you ask folks to do that, it's going to negatively impact their score if they're from an underrepresented group or a group that's stereotypically not expected to excel at that particular skill. And that if you ask them afterwards instead, you don't see that same effect. So I think this idea of just making yourself uncomfortable in sort of holding those realities to be true and understanding that the way somebody else moves through space is different potentially from the way you move through space. And one underrepresented identity isn't the same as any other. So it's not like any one underrepresented group has the monopoly on discomfort. And I think if you aren't from an underrepresented group, that holding that discomfort is a really critical step, because it's what everybody else who's underrepresented has to hold every day, that level of discomfort. And so it's a good feeling if you feel uncomfortable. That's a positive step, because everybody needs to feel a little uncomfortable for us all to understand each other better. If you're totally comfortable, then you're not learning and you're not being challenged. And I think that goes back to what Kameelah said about your sources of information. I think it's a real life goal of mine to be uncomfortable on a regular basis, because that means that I have people in my life who are challenging my ideas and my perspectives. And that's important to me, both personally and professionally. So I see that as a really great first step, is just embracing the discomfort.
Can I ask Liana? So as I'm listening to you talk and I'm reflecting on what I've said, and if I'm someone thinking through this, it sounds really exhausting, right? It's like always being uncomfortable sounds really exhausting. So I'm wondering for you, like how do you manage the fatigue? I know for me, I have to be really careful when and how I engage in these conversations, because it's what I do for work. I'm also part of a very diverse, multicultural family. I'm dealing with disabilities and multiple ethnicities, and the way the world is sort of, particularly around dementia and having blended families, like they're just like these really like heavy ways that you have to move through the world. So I have to choose like when and how I engage in the work. I use a lot of comedic, breaks to try to find other things,
100%.
like music and all kinds of things. But I'm just wondering, if for someone like, just starting to go through the process, like what do you do to keep some levity?
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think levity is going to be the top thing. Sometimes you just have to laugh about it. For me, I mean, one of the, you saw with the Cambodia example, my ultimate solution there was to exit. I recognize the immense privilege in that scenario because you don't always have the choice to exit. I can recognize the discomfort and then choose to let that discomfort go, that I don't lose the lesson, but I do exit the situation. I think in my own life, like you said, I'm very choosy with my personal relationships. I work from home, so I can stare at the wall in between. I also, founded my own company. I think that's a really critical way that I dealt with this in the workplace, is that I have the tremendous privilege and pleasure to co-found Cangrade, and I've been able to build from the ground up the kind of inclusive culture that values diversity, that is the kind of place that I wanted to work in and couldn't find. So I built myself a company so that I would have a safe space in the workplace, and we all come with our different perspectives, and we have uncomfortable conversations all the time, and I really value my colleagues and my organization because of that. And I think it really helps me tremendously when you talk about work-life balance. I mean, you get social support from your workplace just like you get it from home. And so for me, being able to build a company that reflects my values has been an amazing experience for me to have professionally.
And it's a great, Kameelah, I'm so glad that you brought in the piece around recovery. Because it really is important that as we look at addressing bias and really thinking about being all in, and then as humans, we also have to have a time to regroup, recover, reset, and then dive in again and differently. And especially for people kind of newer to the space, it can seem like a huge mountain sometimes, and just recognizing the steps that we all take, and then needing to sometimes just regroup and then go back in again. And Liana, one other thing that I wanted to just highlight that you also shared was just the notion around personal experiences. And so as we look at becoming more aware of our biases and or disrupting biases, the firsthand experience it can do that in almost no other way. So, oftentimes if it's just going to a restaurant that serves a different kind of food, that's one way to start. If it's going to a celebration in your town or your city that represents, a different group than that you are a part of, it's places to start. Thinking about just how you can have different conversations with people at work. And Kameelah started us off also with the notion of, what media sources are you paying attention to and things like that. So again, thinking about where you can move from kind of the intellectual piece to the action piece. And I did put something into the chat as well. If people do have questions, I'd love to bring in questions from the group as well. And while we're waiting for any questions to come in, if we bring this back to kind of the work setting, and if we look at, we've talked a lot about self as we look at raising our awareness and interrupting bias. When we look at things from a team level, and I'll throw this open to either one of you who wants to jump in first. What recommendations do you have for somebody either who's a leader of a team or a team member without positional power to address bias if they're seeing it come up within their team? What might you recommend there?
I'm happy to go first. So one of the exercises that I've found really helpful is to first get an understanding of what the rules of engagement are. So there's, there's sort of the things that you're told when you join a team or a project about how you're going to work together and what the expectations are. And then there are the unwritten rules of how the individuals on your team work and how the team dynamics actually are sort of playing out. So I like to do sort of an unwritten rule exercise and say, what is the stuff underneath the surface about how we get things done in the organization? What things work well for you or don't? And, that can be just a simple mapping exercise conversation that you do, and you kind of capture those things and then think about kind of what are the differences and points of tension and points of sort of support there. And then there are other things like insights. I'm a huge fan of business chemistry from Deloitte, and it's a very easily digestible assessment of how people communicate, how they like to receive information, how they work. And it's sort of broken up into 4 different sort of categories, right? But when you unpack it and look at some of the differences, so for example, I like time to think through my ideas before I have to come into a meeting, and other people can be in the meeting and just sort of riff in the moment. And if I'm in that meeting and my leader, team leader, happens to also be somebody who riffs in the moment, and then, I'm not that person, all of a sudden I feel like they're not engaging in me potentially. Like there are all kinds of things that start to build about my comfort level in those meetings, my comfort level with the leader. Those are like things that are fixable, right? These team dynamic challenges, they're fixable, but if they're not addressed and they're not uncovered for what they are, someone needs more personal space. Somebody else likes to have, a clear agenda before they come into a meeting. Someone's not really into chit chat or small talk. They want to just jump, whatever it is, if those things aren't addressed, and then you start to layer on any level of a difference to which there's discomfort, it can very quickly, these are ER issues that I've dealt with my whole career, where it's someone is feeling like there is an instance of bias, or they're feeling like this person is not showing up, or all of these things start to run, and it's really hard to untangle what's going on, because half of the time, probably more than half of the time, it's about style. But we start to conflate style with all kinds of other stereotypes about individuals or identities that we've heard, and it turns into a big ball of mess. So I think, not to say that you're going to work through all of it, but one of the first things with teams is like, let's get clear, what language are we speaking? How are we working together? What are some of the things that might make our work challenging? And then that can be supported also by a body of work called psychological safety. I know we're going to talk about in a little bit too, but as a leader, are you creating a space where people are comfortable sharing what their needs are? Because if I'm not comfortable, I'm not going to speak up, and then I start to sort of spin in my own head, and it's not going to change the dynamic. So, and as a team member, am I also creating a space for my colleagues that feels comfortable, where they can learn, where they can dissent, they can push back, they can ask questions? So decoding the team dynamics up front, and then being really intentional about creating a space where people can learn and grow and challenge and be challenged.
Yeah, Kameelah, I totally agree with that. And I think for me, conceptually, it speaks to moving towards this idea of not thinking of DE&I as a checkbox quota system, where you've hired X people from X group and X people from this group, so now you're good because everybody visibly looks different. It's about circling back to what we talked through in the beginning of this discussion, which is it needs to be about shifting your core values. And part of that is shifting about how you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion as a concept. And diversity, equity, and inclusion is fundamentally about diversity of perspective and thought, just Kameelah, just like how you were just describing it. And to me, I think intellectually to make that shift is really important, because it informs and trickles down to everything that goes on in your organization. And taking that time, just like you said, Kameelah, to understand what is motivating people, how they talk to you, what they need from you, what soft skills they have, what soft skills they struggle with. It's all of these intangible things that sometimes get lost in this focus and race to build hard skills in the workplace, where you might not end up getting promoted, or you might be seen as unprofessional for some reason, because it's these other intangibles that haven't been appropriately diagnosed and built up if necessary. So if you know you're a manager that likes some sort of direct communication style, and you have an employee working for you who has a very indirect communication style, that could be a huge clash for the two of you. And it might end up being conflated, like Kameelah was saying, with some sort of group identity. And then you can have all kinds of repercussions that occur because of that, because even that perception on the part of your employee, potentially, if they feel like, because of their lived experience, that that's why you're coming down on them in a particular way or passing them up for promotion, that can create a great deal of tension that really could have been addressed, like Kameelah said, by taking the time to understand who's working for you and with you, and how to be most productive with them. And again, that speaks to this idea of discomfort. Being totally comfortable in a workplace is not a good thing. It leads to something in psychology we call groupthink, where everyone thinks the same way and you don't challenge each other and you don't move the discussion in any particular way. So it really ultimately ends up being bad for your bottom line and for your organization. Diversity, equity, inclusion, it's not a nice to have. It is a moral imperative, sure, but it's not just sort of an afterthought cherry on the top of your already perfect organization. It is what makes your organization work smarter and not just, move from point A to point B. It's a critical part of making sure that you're able to leverage your personnel and your resources in the best possible way for your company. And I think this idea of diagnosis that Kameelah is talking about as a starting point, obviously I'm biased, I run an assessment company, but I think that from my perspective is just absolutely a critical jumping off point, and is something that helps you to stay objective about what potentially is going on and resulting in conflict in your organization, and keeps it out of that sort of personal level of conflict where the biases that Deb talked about in the beginning start to leak in and really take over.
Yeah, so it's really getting to that constructive tension, that opportunity to really grow from various perspectives. So we're unfortunately, the time has just flown. So we are unfortunately really short on time here. But I just did want to throw out one more question, then we'll just move to some closing thoughts here. We've talked again about self. We've now talked a little bit about teams and some of the roles that leaders can play, and folks who may not be in a position of having a team reporting to them. When we look at the organizational level, and Kameelah, I'll come to you first. So if we can have just like a 30-second response, what do you think at the organizational level is the most important thing that leaders can do when looking across the company or systemically? And then Liana, I'll come to you for the same question. So Kameelah, 30 seconds here on this one.
Yeah, get clear on your brand purpose around the work, not just a statement, but what's the thing that you want. Be prepared to be in this for the long haul. It's not something that you can sort of set as a project and we'll say in 2 years, we're going to have a fully diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization. It's something that needs to be part of your systems and fully integrated for the foreseeable future. Get clear on your desired outcomes and then be willing to invest. Understand where you are, get an assessment in to see like where you are, where you want to go, and continue to measure progress. Have a team that's dedicated to the work, and make sure you get some external inputs.
Love it. Fantastic. Thank you. Liana,
Same
question.
So I'm going to echo a little bit of what Kameelah already said, but from maybe a slightly different angle, which is just that you need to stay systemic and objective as much as you possibly can about what you value in your organization and what success looks like. I can't tell you how many companies we've talked to who don't have any sort of objective measure of success in their organization. And that does you a tremendous disservice, because first of all, it means that your employees don't know what you value. Second of all, it means your managers don't know what you value. Third of all, it allows the biases that shape everyone's lived experience to really run rampant and interfere with the objective and the systemic evaluation of success and what that means in the context of your organization. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is not divorced from success in your organization. It is what will make your organization successful, and really internalizing that and then establishing metrics that speak louder than that just concept, abstract concept as an idea is critical. Like Kameelah said, you have to put your money where your mouth is. You have to be prepared that this is not just a 1 week process to make this shift. This is a long-term investment. And you have to put your commissions, your bonuses, whatever it is around, wrap them around those values, because the organization will shift to the extent to which you are making sure that valuing diversity, equity, and inclusion is rewarded. And so you need to build up those organizational structures around that really make that value 100% unavoidable.
Well, we could talk about this all day long. There have been so many golden nuggets that have been dropped by Liana and Kameelah through our time today. So just want to thank you both so much for fantastic thought leadership and bringing your personal perspectives, your work experiences into this conversation. And hopefully everybody has been able to pull, a few things that really resonate and really will be able to go back to, as Kameelah said, that self-leadership, that intentionality, and start taking those steps to mitigating bias so that we've got workplaces that work for everyone. So with that, I will pass it back over to Naila.
Well said, Deb. Thank you for that wrap up. And Liana and Kameelah, fantastic. We do have a question, but we're also out of time. And Ryan Wilson said, where can I learn more about the psychological safety pilot and the methods being developed or demoed? Maybe I can connect you, Ryan, to somebody on the panel after this. I'm happy to do that with their permission. And with that, we will wrap it up. You'll hear from me in a few days with some of these resources, and we will post portions of this video with the approval of our panelists. And thank you all so much. I wish you guys a wonderful, wonderful day.